Apparently, the U.S. is engaged in so many military operations around the world, the administration itself can't even agree on which one should be classified as a war. See, just yesterday, Secretary of State John Kerry refused to say that the U.S. is at war with ISIS, instead describing the military's actions in Iraq as a, quote, major counterterrorism operation. But apparently no one at the White House bothered to watch that interview, because just today, White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest said that the U.S. is indeed at war with ISIS. So if we're officially at war with the Middle East, again, it's probably important to understand who ISIS really is. To shed some light on that exact question, I was joined earlier by Reza Aslan, religious scholar and author of the book, How to Win a Cosmic War, God, Globalization, and the End of the War on Terror. I started off by asking him if the goals of ISIS differ from that of Al-Qaeda.
Well, in many ways, ISIS is just kind of an extreme version of Al-Qaeda, but insofar as their ideology, their agenda, their goals, very much along the same lines, even though their tactics, believe it or not, are even more horrific than Al-Qaeda's. These are what's called jihadist organizations. So they are transnationalist in their ideology. They're not interested in any kind of state, despite the fact that they call themselves now the Islamic State. What they want is to reconstitute the globe as a single world order. That's what they mean when they say caliphate. And so responding to a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda is quite a different thing than responding to other more nationalistic terror organizations, for instance, like Hamas or Hezbollah. And
you talk also in that book about the folly of viewing the war on terror through a religious kind of fundamentalist lens, and I wanted you to expand on why that's been so dangerous in regards to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
These are organizations that are fighting not a real war, but a war of the imagination. The bloodshed obviously is real, the brutality, the violence is real. But as far as they're concerned, the battle itself is not between individuals or even armies. The battle is between the forces of good and evil. They really do believe that they are acting out on earth a drama that's actually taking place in heaven. When we legitimize that kind of ideology with our own religious rhetoric, when we talk about good versus evil and these kinds of things, all we do is add fuel to the fire of their religious fanaticism. I mean, I always sort of say that you cannot out-fanaticize these fanatics. So the best way to confront an organization like this is to strip their conflict as much as is possible of any kind of cosmic or religious significance.
And of course, these kind of fundamentalist beliefs don't evolve in a vacuum. What sort of economic and societal factors have bled into the roots of fundamentalism and caused this to kind of proliferate?
This is where things get a little bit complicated, because as any expert, any sociologist will tell you, that the root of terrorism, regardless of whether it's religious terrorism or secular or nationalist terrorism, is some kind of socioeconomic dispossession. You know, whether that be a concern with political rights or with economic rights, what have you. But a jihadist organization like ISIS and Al-Qaeda work differently. These are not poor, dispossessed individuals. In fact, quite often they are middle class or even upper middle class individuals. They're not uneducated. Quite the contrary. They usually have very high education levels, sometimes PhDs. They're engineers, they're doctors, they're lawyers. Now, this may sound odd, but think about this for a minute. If your goal is something as complex and sophisticated as the ridding of all borders and boundaries and national and ethnic identities and the recreation of the globe as a single world order, then you have a certain sort of intellectual capacity that could allow for that kind of idea. If you're a member of Hamas, all you can think about or care about is figuring out a way to feed your children, to give them some kind of future. The globe? The globe is irrelevant to you. Now, that is not to say that there is not a socioeconomic element to the popularity of ISIS, because while they themselves are not poor or dispossessed or marginalized, they've done a marvelous job of reaching out to the poor, the dispossessed, and the marginalized, and this sort of propaganda campaign to make them feel as though this is an organization that is addressing their grievances, that they are fighting on their behalf. And it's a very successful message.
It seems like the strikes that have been conducted so far seem to be on these strategic targets that kind of protect maybe Kurdish oil or things that the U.S. has an invested interest in. And I'm wondering, can't this be like a Nixon goes to China moment for Obama to actually go and reach out to Assad and reach out to other leaders that might be threatened by ISIS and actually put them in the fold? Instead of kind of exacerbating those differences there and just, you know, striking at these targets. I don't know.
You bring up a very, very good point, which is that even if we accelerate these aerial strikes by an order of magnitude, which we will have to if we want to do what President Obama outlined, even if we do that, that's still enough. That's still not enough. You cannot defeat ISIS without boots on the ground. That's just a fact. But it's not going to be American boots, because that's out of the question for a whole host of reasons. That means that we're talking about Syrian boots, we're talking about Kurdish boots, we're talking about particularly Iraqi Sunni boots, and we're talking about Iranian boots. Now, look at this. We have no relationships with Syria. The Kurds we call terrorists. The Iraqi Sunnis, you know, this is the Anbar province. This is a place that we have had very little cooperation with. And we're talking about Iranians. So you're absolutely right that if the goal, if ISIS is the perceived threat that the administration tells us to, this sort of incredible, even existential threat that must be dealt with at all costs, well, all costs means putting aside some of the differences, the nationalistic differences that the United States has with our perceived allies in this fight. I mean, the one amazing thing, the remarkable thing about ISIS is the way that it has already brought all of these enemies together. Turkey and the PKK are on the same team. Iran and the United States, we're on the same team. Even the Sunni and the Shia, Iran and Saudi Arabia, are actually on the same. These are two countries that have been fighting a war for 30 years. Now they have a common enemy. So I suppose, like in my dream fantasy, that this threat could be the kind of threat that would ultimately bring together these groups that have been enemies for so many years, you know, because we're fighting a common foe. But that would require bold decision making. It would require putting aside politics, and, well, you know, enough said.
It just seems like this whole, you know, Obama's speech last night and kind of this military intervention almost is taking a page right out of the Bush doctrine. You just made a very good point where you said there is no threat to Americans here.
There's no threat to Americans.
You know, should we support that kind of preemptive measures of striking before there's an actual threat to the homeland?
I don't think that you can say the proper argument for confronting ISIS militarily is to protect the American homeland. That's not a good argument. But there is a good argument, and that is that this is an organization that is in the midst of a genocidal campaign, a ethnic cleansing of Shia and Christians from Iraq at the very least. And if you are the kind of person who believes that the United States has an obligation to stop genocide, and there's no other term for what these guys are doing except genocide, if you believe that, then you support these strikes. If you don't, then you don't. But if you think that these strikes are a good idea to protect the United States, then I think at that point you're stretching the imagination
well,
a bit.
Here's something that you've been outspoken about, and this is, I think, the crux of everything, even 9/11, when you're looking at these 28 redacted pages of the joint inquiry. Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
This partnership with the U.S., their role in funding, you know, aspects of 9/11, and then you take it back. Here we are in the anniversary.
The very ideology of ISIS.
The week of the anniversary of 9/11, and here we see that Saudi Arabia is invested in kind of the continuation of ISIS. Sanctions, anything going to happen in terms of cutting off this partnership, or is the oil that big of a deal?
For right now, it is.
So it trumps the ISIS threat, then?
It trumps the ISIS threat. You know, one thing that I always try to tell people that drives them crazy, but unfortunately it's true, is that We have to understand that foreign policy is not about solving problems. It's about maintaining interests. If the United States didn't have an interest in destroying ISIS, it wouldn't, regardless of the slaughter. And if the United States didn't have an interest in preserving its relationship with Saudi Arabia, we would pretend that the Saudi regime doesn't even exist. And by the way, that's not necessarily too far in the distance. Part of the whole push towards so-called energy independence is to be able to finally turn our backs on the Saudis. But as it is, the perceived interest in that relationship is too great. But that said, I always try to remind people, when we saw, the horrible beheadings of those two Western journalists that focused the attention of the United States and this administration on the problem of ISIS, since August 4th, Saudi Arabia has beheaded 20 people.
Exactly.
The vast majority for nonviolent offenses. So maybe even just a little word, perhaps, from our administration to just acknowledge that fact might go a long way towards, at the very least, focusing the attention of the region. That said, I do think that at the very least, the government of Saudi Arabia, and when I say government, I mean that this country is the sole property of a particular clan, the clan that rules Saudi Arabia, has also recognized the monster that they have helped create in ISIS. And for now, we'll see, but for now, all signs point to the fact that they seem to be, at the very least, willing to do their part in cutting off funding, in trying to combat them from an ideological perspective, in sending money and resources. We'll see.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to wrap this up by playing a clip of Obama's speech. Let's take a listen to that.
Moreover, I've made it clear that we will hunt down terrorists who threaten our country wherever they are. That means I will not hesitate to take action against ISIL in Syria as well as Iraq. This is a core principle of my presidency. If you threaten America, you will find no safe haven.
Okay, so here's the problem here. I mean, he's talking about, first of all, if you're threatening America, we already know that this isn't really about protecting America. Also, the problem is Iraq is one thing. Of course, when you leave this country destabilized and the troops aren't properly trained and they're not going to fight and die for Maliki, but then Syria.
Yep.
Syria, here we were kind of funding this other side, and now we're saying carte blanche authority to bomb Syria without the authorization of Assad.
Well done. That, as I have been telling everybody, is the headline of the speech, that we are about to bomb Syria. It's amazing how that has just kind of gotten buried in everything else that the president said, but that's the headline. Now, one can say that, well, we were going to bomb Syria last year, but the Congress put a stop to it, and perhaps now the Congress, is in a place where they're not willing to, because of the enormous American support for such a campaign, to put a stop to it. And so perhaps the president is doing what he's wanted to do for quite some time now, but let's not lose focus. It's one thing for an aerial bombardment of Iraq when the Iraqi government is begging for it, when the Iraqi population is begging for it, but if we're saying that we're going to start bombing Raqqa, which is where, the home base of ISIS in Syria is, that means that we are going to allow ISIS to start spreading into the rest of Syria, perhaps in western and northern Syria. Does that mean we're going to continue the bombing campaign? Are we doing this in coordination with the Assad regime, or the military at the very least? Are we doing it in coordination with the Free Syrian Army? That might have been a pretty good idea 2 years ago, but now, 2 years later, I mean, in many cases, the Free Syrian Army has been responsible for the same kind of gross violations of human rights that ISIS is responsible for. This is the sticky part, like I said. I mean, for everyone who heard that speech yesterday, that little clause, including Syria, should have been the thing that set off alarm bells.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your incredible insight. Reza Aslan.
My pleasure.
Author, religious scholar. Really appreciate you coming on.